There is a photograph taken somewhere on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943. A Tiger tank sits motionless at the edge of a frozen road, its turret slightly turned, its engine cold, not destroyed, not knocked out, simply abandoned. It ran out of fuel 40 kilometers from the nearest supply depot, and no recovery vehicle in the entire sector had the capacity to tow 57 tons of precision-engineered steel back to a repair station. That single image tells you more about why Germany lost its armored war than any battlefield after-action report ever could. We tend to think of military failure in dramatic terms: catastrophic defeats, encirclements, last stands. But some of the most consequential failures in history are quiet, administrative, bureaucratic. They happen not on the battlefield, but in the planning rooms where someone decides how a weapon will be used and gets it wrong. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had a weapon that was genuinely superior to anything your enemy could field, you could only use it effectively 30% of the time. Would you still consider it superior? And be honest, do you think the people who designed the system ever truly reckoned with that question? Or did they assume the technology would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, because the story we are about to walk through suggests the answer is far more uncomfortable than most military histories are willing to admit. This is the story of the Schwere Panzerabteilungen, Germany's independent heavy tank battalions, and how irrational, defensible organizational decisions slowly became a structural trap that no amount of engineering brilliance could escape. To understand how this happened, you need to understand the moment in which the decision was made and why. At that moment, it made sense. The second half of 1942 was not a time of confidence for the German army. The initial shock of Barbarossa had worn off. The Soviets had survived, reorganized, and begun producing armor at rates that German intelligence found difficult to believe. The T-34 had already demonstrated Panzer III and Panzer IV were no longer dominant platforms. Something heavier, more powerfully armed, and more heavily armored was needed. The Tiger I, the Panzerkampfwagen 6, entered series production in August 1942. It was, by any honest technical assessment, a remarkable vehicle. Its 8.8 centimeter KWK-36 cannon could engage and destroy virtually any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Its frontal armor, 100 millimeters thick, was effectively impervious to most anti-tank weapons in service at the time. In a direct engagement at a favorable range, the Tiger was close to untouchable, but it was also rare. Total production of the Tiger I across its entire production life amounted to roughly 1,347 units. Compare that to the more than 49,000 Shermans produced by the United States, or the approximately 84,000 T-34 variants built by the Soviet Union. The Tiger was never going to be a mass production weapon. It was, from birth, a scarce strategic asset, and this is where the critical decision was made. The Oberkommando des Heers, the Army High Command, chose not to distribute Tigers organically into existing panzer divisions. Instead, they created independent battalions, Schwere Panzerabteilungen. Each battalion would field approximately 45 Tigers, organized into 3 companies of 14 vehicles each, plus headquarters tanks, maintenance units, supply elements, and communications teams. These battalions would belong to no division. They would operate as tactical reserves, assigned temporarily to corps or army groups based on operational need. The logic was clean. If you have a small number of extremely powerful weapons, use centralized control. You keep them at a higher echelon where experienced staff officers can allocate them to the point of greatest need. You prevent local commanders from squandering them on secondary tasks. You concentrate their firepower where it matters most. On paper, this was coherent military reasoning, but paper does not break down on frozen roads. Paper does not consume 400 liters of fuel to travel 100 kilometers. Paper does not require a specialized 8-ton jack and a team of trained mechanics to replace a single torsion bar. The Tiger did, and the system built to manage it was about to collide with reality in ways that no staff officer in a planning room had fully anticipated. The first fracture in the system was logistical, and it was visible almost immediately. A A Tiger I consumed fuel at a rate roughly 3 to 4 times higher than a Panzer, 4 per kilometer traveled. Its Maybach HL210 engine, later upgraded to the HL230, was powerful but temperamental, requiring maintenance intervals that were dramatically shorter than those of simpler, lighter vehicles. The transmission, a marvel of German engineering precision, demanded specialist technicians and specific replacement parts that were not interchangeable with any other vehicle in the Wehrmacht's inventory. When a Schwere Panzerabteilung was assigned to support a division, it arrived with its own maintenance crews, its own recovery assets, and its own supply train. But here is the structural problem. The receiving division had none of these things calibrated for the Tiger. Its fuel allocations were calculated for Panzer IVs and half-tracks. Its repair depots stocked parts for those vehicles. Its recovery vehicles, typically 18-ton half-tracks, could not tow a 57-ton Tiger that had thrown a track or suffered an engine failure. The result was a pattern that repeated itself across every front where Tigers operated. Vehicles broke down on approach marches. Broken down vehicles could not be recovered. Unrecoverable vehicles were either destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture or simply left behind. Battalions that were authorized for 45 tanks routinely entered combat with 15, 20, sometimes fewer. The operational diaries of units like Schwere Panzerabteilung 501, 502, and 503 on the Eastern Front tell the same story with grinding consistency. Availability rates fluctuated between 30 and 50%, not because the crews were careless, not because the maintenance teams were unskilled, but because the entire logistical architecture surrounding these battalions was mismatched to the vehicle they operated. Think of it this way. Imagine you own the single fastest racing car ever built, but the only pit crew available to service it is trained on family sedans. The fuel station carries the wrong octane, and the tow truck cannot lift it if it stalls. The car is still extraordinary, but the system around it has made its extraordinary qualities largely theoretical. The second fracture was temporal, a problem of time and decision-making speed. When a Soviet armored thrust threatened to break through a German defensive line, the local division commander could not simply call upon the nearest Tiger battalion. The battalion did not belong to him. It belonged to the Corps or the Army group. A request had to travel up the chain of command. Staff officers at a higher headquarters, sometimes 50 or 100 kilometers behind the front, had to evaluate that request against competing demands from other sectors. A decision had to be made. Orders had to be issued. And then the battalion had to physically move to the threatened sector. On roads, in vehicles that could manage perhaps 20 to 30 kilometers per hour under ideal conditions, and considerably less in mud, snow, or damaged terrain. The lag between identification of a crisis and arrival of the response could easily exceed 12 hours. In 1943 and 1944, 12 hours was an eternity. The Soviet Mechanized Corps could advance 30 kilometers in that time. By the time the Tigers arrived, the situation they had been sent to address had often transformed beyond recognition. This was not a failure of the Tiger. It was a failure of the system's clock speed. The centralized decision architecture was simply too slow for the tempo of operations on the Eastern Front. Let me ask you something here, and I think this is genuinely worth reflecting on. Can you think of any situation, military or otherwise, where the desire to control a valuable resource centrally actually ended up making that resource less effective? I suspect most of you can, because this pattern is not unique to armored warfare. It appears in business, in technology, in governance. The instinct to centralize what is precious often conflicts directly with the need to deploy it quickly. There was a third fracture, less discussed but equally damaging: the problem of coordination. Every time a Schwere Panzerabteilung was attached to a new division, it was, in practical terms, entering a joint operation with strangers. The infantry battalions it was supposed to support had never trained with it. The artillery batteries that should have been suppressing anti-tank positions in advance of its attack were operating on different radio frequencies, using different map reference systems, following different standard procedures. The Tiger crews did not know the terrain the way the local units did. The local units did not understand the Tiger's capabilities or limitations. In a well-integrated Panzer division, these problems were solved by months or years of shared training, shared exercises, and the slow accumulation of institutional trust. Tank commanders knew their infantry counterparts by name. Radio procedures were second nature. Everyone understood the rhythm. The Schwere Panzerabteilungen had none of this. Every deployment was an improvisation, and improvisation under fire, against an enemy that was growing more competent and more numerous with each passing month, was a recipe for friction. What makes this story analytically powerful rather than merely unfortunate is comparison. Every major combatant in the Second World War faced the same fundamental question. How do you integrate heavy, specialized armored vehicles into a combined arms framework? None of them found a perfect answer, but the answers they chose produced dramatically different outcomes. The Soviet Union, after suffering catastrophic armored losses in 1941 and 1942, undertook a doctrinal reorganization of extraordinary scope. Heavy tanks, the KV-1S and later the IS-2 with its devastating 122mm gun, were organized into Guards heavy tank regiments and brigades designated for breakthrough operations. But critically, Soviet doctrine evolved toward increasingly tight integration of these heavy elements with the infantry and artillery formations they were supporting. The IS-2 was not held in distant reserve, waiting for a committee to authorize its release. It was pushed forward into direct support roles, operating alongside the riflemen who needed it. The Soviet logistical system was, by Western standards, crude, but it possessed a quality that the German system increasingly lacked: resilience. Soviet heavy tanks were designed with wider tolerances, simpler components, and a pragmatic acceptance that elegance mattered less than reliability. An IS-2 could be maintained in conditions that would have been fatal to a Tiger's transmission. It was not a better tank in every measurable parameter, but it was a more usable tank within the system that surrounded it. The Americans made an even more radical choice. They largely refused to build heavy tanks at all. The M6 heavy tank program was canceled. The M26 Pershing arrived in theater only in the final months of the European War in very small numbers. Instead, the United States chose to fight its armored war with the M4 Sherman, a tank that was lighter, less powerfully armed, and less heavily armored than the Tiger by every quantitative measure. But the Sherman could be produced in staggering quantities. It could be maintained by crews with basic mechanical training. It could cross bridges that would collapse under a Tiger. It could be shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of standard cargo vessels. And when one was destroyed, another was available within days, sometimes hours. The American Army supplemented the Sherman with tank destroyer battalions, the M10, the M18 Hellcat, the M36 Jackson, that operated within divisional structures and could be redistributed internally with an agility that the Schwere Panzerabteilungen could never match. The philosophy was explicit: accept tactical inferiority in individual engagements and compensate with mass, mechanical availability, logistical simplicity, and speed of replacement. The British followed a hybrid path. The Churchill infantry tank was employed in squadron-level attachments to infantry divisions, operating in close and habitual relationships with the units it supported. Not centralized, not held in reserve for crisis response, embedded, familiar, and available. None of these approaches were flawless. Soviet heavy tank regiments suffered terrible losses. Shermans burned. Churchills were too slow for exploitation. But all of them avoided the specific trap that ensnared the Schwere Panzerabteilungen: the creation of an elite asset so specialized, so centrally controlled, and so logistically demanding that the system required to employ it effectively could not keep pace with the battlefield it was supposed to influence. There is a counterfactual worth examining here, not because counterfactuals prove anything, but because they illuminate the mechanisms at work. What if the Tigers had been distributed organically? One heavy company per Panzer division, perhaps 12 to 14 vehicles embedded within the division's permanent structure. Several problems dissolve simultaneously in this scenario. Maintenance becomes continuous rather than episodic. Division-level technicians grow familiar with the Tiger's specific demands through daily contact. They learn the idiosyncrasies of the Maybach engine, the weak points of the transmission, the telltale signs of torsion bar fatigue, not from a manual, but from experience accumulated over weeks and months. Logistics become integrated. Fuel and ammunition for the Tiger Company are planned within the same supply cycle as every other element of the division. No discontinuity, no improvised requisitions, no scrambling to find the right engine oil at a depot that has never seen a Tiger before. Coordination becomes habitual. The Tiger Company commander knows his infantry battalion commanders. They have trained together. They have shared maps, shared frequencies, shared meals. When the order comes to counterattack, no one needs to introduce themselves, and availability becomes immediate. The divisional commander does not need to petition a distant headquarters. The Tigers are his. He decides when and where to commit them. The counterargument is real. Distributing a scarce resource across many divisions means each division gets very few. A company of 14 Tigers lacks the concentrated punch of a battalion of 45. There are missions, deliberate breakthroughs, emergency blocking actions, where mass matters and 14 is not 45. But this argument assumes that 45 were actually available when needed, and the operational record says they rarely were. A battalion of 45 Tigers on paper that consistently fielded 15 to 20 in practice may have been less effective than a company of 14 that reliably fielded 12, because those 12 were in the right place, at the right time, with the right support, operating alongside people who knew how to work with them. Concentration has value only when the system can deliver the concentrated force to the point of decision in time to matter. And that is precisely what the independent battalion structure repeatedly failed to do. The Schwere Panzerabteilungen were not failures in the conventional sense. Their crews fought with extraordinary skill and courage. Units like the 501st, the 502nd, the 503rd compiled engagement records that, in terms of kill-to-loss ratios, remain among the most impressive in the history of armored warfare. But those records are deceptive. They measure what happened when the Tigers were present and operational. They do not measure the days spent on rail flat cars, waiting for transport priority. They do not measure the approach marches, consumed half the battalion's operational readiness before a single shot was fired. They do not measure the opportunities lost while a staff officer at Corps headquarters debated whether to release the battalion to Sector A or Sector B. The deepest lesson embedded in this history is not about tanks. It is about a category error that organizations of all kinds commit with disturbing regularity. Technical excellence and systemic effectiveness are independent variables. They can coexist, but one does not guarantee the other. A weapon of extraordinary capability, embedded in an organizational structure that cannot deliver it to the fight in time, in sufficient numbers, with adequate support, and in coordination with the forces it is supposed to complement. That weapon is not extraordinary. It is expensive. The Tiger did not lose the war. No single weapon system could have. But the bureaucratic architecture that governed its employment ensured that its remarkable qualities were experienced by the enemy only intermittently, unpredictably, and never at the scale or the tempo that might have altered the operational calculus in Germany's favor. The machine was exceptional. The system was not. And in war, as in almost everything else, it is the system that wins or loses. The machine is just along for the ride. One last thought to leave you with. In your own life, your own work, have you ever seen something genuinely excellent fail? Not because of what it was, but because of the structure it was trapped inside? I suspect you have, and I suspect the memory still bothers you. So, what do you think really broke the Tiger's power in the end? Enemy fire, or the system behind it? Leave your take in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next Noctel documentary.